Hi guys, I'm Roland. I work at RisingStack as a full-stack developer, and today I wanted to talk about classless React. In the last couple of months we were experimenting building our front-end applications without using any outside state managers from React, which is actually a big thing nowadays, and it turned out to be pretty good. So that's why I wanted to share our experiences with you. First, I'm going to have a couple of questions. Who is familiar with React? A lot of people, yeah. Who is using React for front-end development right now? Oh, that's nice. And who is using functional component with React hooks? There's pretty much of people. Nice. So, for the starting, you can see a summary here about my presentation. First, I'm going to have some talk about the idiomatic way of using React right now with classes. And after that, I'm going to introduce you to functional components, and then we will see what is a hook and how do we use local state, context, lifecycle, caching with hooks. And after that, I'm going to show you some examples for building your own custom hooks. And then I will talk about the rules of using a hook. So for the first thing, there is the idiomatic way of using React. You are probably familiar with using React with classes. You usually have a render component, a constructor, you have object state, which is always an object. You have to call the set state to update the state. You are using the this keyword all over your component. You are binding the functions if you are not using arrow functions, because you want to access the this keyword inside your handler functions. You probably have huge lifecycle methods, and you might have some wrapper components to share some logic besides your class components. So overall, you will have a lot of code, which is pretty hard to maintain. So you might say that, why would I use that if I have MobX or Redux, which is a lot easier to use? The code will be a lot more readable. Well, you might not have to use them anymore. When it comes to classes, I have a basic example here, an app class which has a render function, and it's going to render you a header with a text in it, which is saying hello to the name property of the props. If you want to build that with functional component, it will look something like this. You can already spot the syntax differences between the two. You will see that function component are just functions. They don't have render methods. There's no constructor, no use of the this keywords because the scope changed. And you will see less code, which is more easier to understand and maintain. But why didn't we use React like this? We actually used them. We just didn't use them that much because you were only using functional components if you were only using props and no other React features, because you didn't have lifecycles or local state for functional components. And you were also using functional components if you were using like MobX for state management. So here comes hooks. Hooks was released this year, 6th of February, and some of you might have missed it. So let's get to it. What is a hook? Hook is a function provided by React, which lets you hook into React features from your functional component. This is exactly what we need to use functional components instead of classes. So hooks will give you all React features without classes. It will make your code more maintainable. It will let you reuse stateful logic. And since you are reusing stateful logic, you will avoid the wrapper hell and the component reimplementation. And actually, hooks is backward compatible, so you can update your React safely. So hooks actually makes React great again. You won't need MobX or Redux anymore. So how to use a hook? I will have some examples here. I have one example app which is full of examples how to use a hook, and you can check out that application source code with this GitHub URL. So let me show you the demo I have here. I have a pretty simple application with a React router, and each of these navigation items are my examples. The first one you already saw. It was just showing you the name prop with a header. The second one is it's a bit more. You have a button which will increase your text font size. So let's look at the code of it. I hope everyone can read it. It's a class app component. You can see that we have a constructor. We are using the state, which is an object. We are binding a handler function. We are using this everywhere. And also you have your render method. Once again, define an object state, use the set state, and bind or use arrow functions. What if you want to use that with a class component, now you can import something from React called useState. useState is a function which accepts one property, which is the initial value of your function, and it will return you a tuple, which is an ordered values, and the first value is going to be your actual state. The second value is going to be the function which will let you update this state. So now you don't need this anymore because the scope changed, and you don't need to bind anything. You can define non-object states, like for instance it's a number here, and you can use multiple states inside a functional component. You can also use object or an array for a state, but be sure when you are updating them and you don't want to update all of their properties, you are using the spread operator because these states are going to be immutable. So let's have another example for context. If you are not familiar with context, context is a React feature which will let you pass data through your component tree without passing down the props in each class component inside your application. So you will be able to access a variable anywhere in your application. You just have to wrap your component with a consumer which will return you the value. It's like a global variable, but you can still scope it. So let me show you an example for that. As you can see in the code, we changed the hello string to use the name from the context inside of the props. So if I click on the context class example, you will see that the name changed to Bela. You can check the source code in the GitHub repository. So how do you use that with a functional component? If you want to use context, you just use context and pass the context as a parameter, and it will return you the value of the context. And since you do it before the return, you will have the same scope as your state, and you won't need any extra wrappers inside your applications. So the next one is lifecycles. This code is pretty big, so let's close the render method. Here, in this example, we want to log out to the console the font size every time it changes, and also at the initial amount. So we are using the usual component did mount and component did update for that to achieve such a thing. Let me show it to you. So we have a lifecycle class, and if I tap that button, you can see that the font size is logged in the console. Well, lifecycles was one thing you couldn't do in functional components, so you now have a lifecycle for it called useEffect. UseEffect is a function which accepts one property, which is also a function, and this function will be run, executed on every component render. You can actually add an optional second parameter, which is an array full of variables. If you want your useEffect to only update, only run your first argument when a specific argument is updated, like I did it in the component did update with an if statement, you can just pass a second argument, which is an array, and add the variables you want to listen to. You can actually do that with an empty array, which will mean that your useEffect will run only once on the first render. So how do we do that with our example application? We just import the useEffect and call it with a font size dependency. And you have one function instead of two. You can actually add multiple useEffects, and useEffect is much better than component did update or did mount or will mount lifecycle methods, because you can separate multiple useEffects based on what they do instead of when they do it, because you are always going to have one component did update or one component did mount, but you can separate the useEffects based on the logic. There is one more thing you can do with useEffects. You can return a function inside your first argument, which is going to be the cleanup function, which is going to be called after the useEffect is finished. So I will show an example for you sometime later on that. So the next thing is caching. If you want to increase your rendering speed, you have one very simple way of doing that. You might already heard about it. It's memoizing. Memoizing is, if you are not familiar with it, it's, let's say you have a function. It accepts arguments and it returns a value. If you want to run that function multiple times, and sometimes you run that function with the same arguments, you don't want that function to recalculate the outcome. You just want to cache your outcome for a set of arguments and return that from the cache instead of rerunning the whole calculation. So with React, you can use that with two new hooks called useMemo and useCallback. useMemo will actually memoize a variable. It accepts two parameters. The first one is the function which is calculating. The second parameter is an array of dependencies which the useMemo will listen to. useMemo will know when to update based on the second parameter, and the useCallback is pretty much the same, but it's for functions. So if you want to have a function in your functional component, which is a handler function, for instance, and you don't want that to be recreated every time your functional component updates, you can just wrap it in a useCallback, and your application will be faster. So let me show you an example for that. I have some code here. We have an array of words, which are strings, and we have a functional component called app. This app functional component has two states. The first state is a counter. The second state is a word index, which is going to point to any of these words. So what do we show here? We show here that there is a counter which is going to show you the count, and there is a button which is going to increase this counter. And we have another segment here which is going to show you the letter count of the selected word, and you will have a button which is going to increase the word index, and so it's going to point to a new word. And we have one variable here called letter count, which is going to count you the letters of this word. But let's say that counting the letters of this word is pretty expensive. So I have a totally fake segment here, which is going to have lifecycle for a while. So it is going to slow down our application pretty much. But if you use useMemo and add the dependencies to it, which is only the word and the function which is calculating your letters, then if I click on the counter button, this calculation should not rerun. But if I click the other button and the word is changing, this should be rerun. You see that I have a console log here, which is going to indicate you that the calculation is being processed. So I have this memo example here, and you can see that we are pointing to the hey word, which has 3 letters. It's already counted. And if I click on the counter, you can't see anything on the console log. But if I click on the next word, it's pretty slow. You can see that we are waiting like 1 second to count it. You can see that the counter is going on. And if I click on the counter again, it's not counting the letters. So it is working. So custom hooks. You can build your own custom hooks for your functional components, which will let you to share and reuse stateful logic on components by extracting code. You will no more need for any wrapper components to access shared logic, and which will indicate that your componentry will be kept as simple as possible. So let me show you a custom hook. We have a custom hook here called useWindowWidth, which is going to have a state which is called window, and it will also have a effect. Custom hooks are made from core React hooks. In this example, we are using useEffect and useState for that. useEffect will be only executed once on the first render because it has an empty array of a second parameter. So it is listening to nothing. It will create you a function which is going to set your window width with the current window width. And we will add an event listener to the window for the resize. This resize event listener will call the handle resize, which is going to set the state again. And we also have a cleanup function here, because if we are unmounting our functional component, we want to remove this event listener. And at the end, we are returning the width. So how do you use that in our application? Let's say we don't want a button to increase our font size, but we want the font size to be based on the window width. You just use window width, which is going to give you the current window width, and you will set a useEffect for it, which is going to set the font size based on the window width. Let's see how that works. There is our custom hook. So you can see that Hello John is, it's pretty big, but we can make it smaller or even bigger with just this amount of code. And with that custom hook, you can use it anywhere in your application. Here's another custom hook for you called useDebounce. If you don't know what debounce means, is we call debounce for something when you are delaying the processing of changing a variable. So let's say you have an input field and you are inputting, texting some strings to it, and you only want to like change it after a couple of seconds. Then you can create a hook called useDebounce, which is going to get the value the user pressed on the input, and you are going to give it a delay, which is going to say how much time should it wait until it return you a debounced value. So it has a state, which is the debounced value, which we're going to return, and we only want to update this debounced value after a timeout has been done. So we are creating a useEffect, which is listening for the value and for the delay. The delay is probably not going to change, but once the value is changing, it's going to create a new set timeout, which is going to set the debounce value after the delay. And for the cleanup, once the value changed, the cleanup will rerun and clear the timeout from the past. So here you have a hook which you can use all over your applications without any extra wrapper component. Just import the useDebounce and use it. So the rules of hook club. There is actually two very simple rules if you want to use hooks. Only call hooks at the top level. Don't call hooks inside loops, conditions, or nested functions. This will preserve the state of the hook between multiple states and useEffect. And the second rule of hooks is only call hooks from React functions. So you can call hooks on functional components or from custom hooks. This will ensure that all stateful logic in a component is clearly visible for its source code. I have some resources for you. There is actually more core React features for hooks. For instance, you have useRef or useReducer. I would like you to read the documentation if you want to try them out. And if you want to find some example for custom hooks, you can use the usehooks.com or the hooks guide, because they are very handy. I for example, found the use key press or use hover or other great examples for creating a custom hook, or you can also Google it. But I would like you to create your own hooks instead of copy-pasting it from the internet, because it's much more fun and you will understand them more easily. So for closing, I would like you to try out hooks and functional components in a new project if you want to. And if you get a hang of it and you like it, you can still use class components. You don't have to use functional components. But if you like it, you can update your current projects to at least React 16.8 without breaking anything, and slowly update your project from class components to functional components, so everyone can read your code more easily and maintain it more easily and create a whole new world with custom hooks, which is a lot of fun. Anyone has any questions? No, thank you.